So today, let's see if this will actually work. Come here. Yeah. It's going to magically happen. Oh my God, you guys, my computer is ridiculous today. So let's go, here we go. So I had some conversations with Carrie about, what might be useful or helpful for you. And this is one of the topics that I think about a lot, especially with coaches, that we have probably all been in a situation where a coach has yelled at us to focus, just focus. Or maybe we were the ones who were telling people to focus, but nobody ever really talks about like what that is or what that does or what it means or, what to focus on. So, I think it can be really clarifying to think about, well, what do we really mean when we say focus and concentration, and to kind of go through some definitions today, and to think about, and then some steps of, well, how do we actually incorporate appropriate direction to our players, right? So that, yes, we want them to focus, but what should they be focusing on? Should they be focusing on their footwork, the ball, the trajectory, the strategy, there's a lot of things that we could focus on, and you want to make sure that you're picking the best thing in the moment. So fancy definition, right? This deliberate mental effort on what's most important in a given situation. So the ability not just to decide what to focus on, but also can we shift and change it as necessary? You might use the term concentration or attention, or because we like to be fancy in academia, we call it attentional focus, because, why use one word when you can use two? So all of these terms in the literature are basically interchangeable. And one of the things that I think we also want to clarify is, because I get a lot of athletes who come to me and they say, I don't want to think about anything. And what they're really trying to describe is this like flow state where everything is just happening on autopilot, right? That you're totally in sync, everything is firing on all cylinders. And what this really means is that what you're thinking and what you're doing are actually the same. We get tripped up when what we're doing and what our thinking are incongruous, right? And that's when we think we get distracted and whatever. So what we're trying to ensure is that what we're concentrating on and what we are and the actions that we're taking are perfectly aligned. And that's when we experience that flow state. So are we paying attention to things from the past that we messed up on, that we want to fix, that we want to do differently? Are we focusing on things that are yet to happen? I get this a lot with, especially with baseball players, of like, well, if I do this, then I have to do this, and then I have to do this, sort of like game out like the next like 5 steps instead of like focusing on the thing that they're supposed to be doing right this minute. They may be focusing on things out of their control. They may be focusing on things that are irrelevant. And the other part of this is that anxiety has a huge impact on your ability to concentrate, right? That if a kid is anxious for whatever reason, that 2 things. One, you have difficulty maintaining that sustained concentration, right? So your brain is like all over the place. But the other thing that anxiety does that a lot of people don't know about is that it narrows your field of vision. So even if you wanted to focus on something else, you can't actually see it. So your peripheral vision kind of goes from here to here. You only see like what's right in front of you. So there are very real specific physiological outcomes that can happen when you are anxious that can impact your concentration. and try to think about like what exactly you're supposed to be looking at. So there are 4 big parts of concentration. One is focusing on the relevant emotional cue or environmental cues, right? So understanding what things to pay attention to and what things to disregard. What are the things that we can sort of let fall away? And how can we filter out more appropriately the distractors? 2, maintaining attentional focus over a sustained period of time, right, which can take a lot of energy. Situational awareness is not just focused on what you are doing as a player, but also what's going on around you. And then attentional flexibility is the ability to shift your focus when you need to. And we'll talk about different parts of our components of a soccer game that would lend itself to that. So we want to make sure that we're paying attention to the right things, given the context that we're in and given the demands that are required of us, and then can we sustain that over time? So relevant environmental cues, generally speaking, it's important to know that we want an external focus, right? Something that is outside of ourselves, outside of what we are actually feeling and thinking and doing. That a lot of the literature shows that when we have an external focus in general, and I'll talk about in a second the specific instances when we want an internal focus, but generally we see performance outcomes. We're able to have better balance, more accuracy, we're able to produce more force, we're more efficient when we move, because we're not overly paying attention to things that are irrelevant. And this will make sense as we go along. Maintaining attentional focus, this is one of those things where this is sort of like endurance, right? Focus and endurance, or concentration and endurance. I think one of the things that we kind of forget is that this takes a lot of cognitive energy. If you've ever taken like a standardized test, right, and you sit there and it's 2 or 3 hours long, and you come out of it and your brain is exhausted, right? You're so tired, or you've worked all day on a project, or you have been in really intense emotional conversations, or you find yourself doing this sustained cognitive work, and you're like, oh my God, I didn't even do anything. Why am I so tired? Right? It's because you were working, your brain was working. And just because you weren't being physically active doesn't mean you weren't expending a lot of energy. So now we're asking our players to expend a lot of physical energy and a lot of cognitive energy. And so if they don't have that cognitive endurance, they're gonna fatigue really quickly. Maintaining situational awareness is sort of, just what is going on around you. And I like this GIF a lot because Aaron Rodgers is one of the best people at situational awareness. He's looking at this situation. He sees there's a player at the top of the screen who's kind of jogging off to the sideline. He's been substituted, right? But Aaron Rodgers says, oh, if I can get this play off as quickly as possible, they're going to get a penalty called on them because they have too many men on the field. So if I can do this before he gets off the field, I'm going to get free yardage. So his ability to see sort of what's going on out of the corner of his eye and says, oh, I can take advantage of this situation, right? And he can make a snap decision that's going to benefit his team. So how can we assess the game situation? How can we read our opponents? What do we think directionality, where are they going to go? What are they planning on doing? And then how can we make better decisions based on those things that we're seeing? And then attentional flexibility. And this is, shifting between external broad attention, external narrow, internal broad, and internal narrow. And so how can we decide which kind of focus that, is going to be the most useful to us? there are certain times within soccer games, right, that you want to have one or the other. So we look at a broad external, right? This is assessing a situation that is often changing. So if we have somebody who's doing a corner kick, right, and you've got all your players are sort of like vying for the best field position, right, that you as a, you know, in the corner, and you want to assess who's creating space, who's drawing a defender away, who would be the smartest person to, you know, or do I have a specific person that I'm trying to find, that there's, you know, sort of scanning where people are as they shift and adjust. And broad internal, this is where this is analyzing, also strategizing, planning, right? So you can see here is a picture of Tim Howard as he's sort of trying to organize, you know, his team, sort of thinking about what are broader decisions that he might make as sort of overall sort of strategizing of what's to happen next. An external narrow focus. So you're looking at a very specific outward execution of a skill. So in Ashlyn Harris's example here, she's very focused on the ball, right? Where is the ball going? She's not focused on what other, necessarily what other players are doing. She's got a singular, narrow, external focus on this ball's trajectory. And then internal narrow this is more appropriate for a discrete skill. So here we have Megan Rapinoe about to take a free kick. You know, she's preparing herself for that skill or that action. So she's trying to ready herself to make the best decision, make the best kick. She might run through it in her mind for a minute. You know, she might have a cue phrase or a cue word that she wants to focus on that is going to help her execute this one specific discrete skill. So you can see as a player that you may have to choose in different situations, right, which type of focus is going to be the best for you at that time. And it can be really easy, right, when we are, let's say we're standing there for a free kick and we're like, ooh, do you remember that last time you missed that free kick? Right, that would be an unhelpful distractor, right? We're thinking about things in the past. Or if I don't make this free kick, what does that mean for our team? We're down, you know, 1-0. So, you know, this is the big opportunity, and you're thinking of like the, you know, things that are outside of your control, right? So when we have an internal narrow focus, then we're making sure that we're dedicating ourselves to this specific skill, and everything else can fall away. So when we compare this attentional processing between expert players and novice players, what we see is that expert players attend to more advanced information, so they make better decisions because they're better able to anticipate, right? That they can look at things like how a play is developing and say, oh, I see what's happening. And they can kind of anticipate that next step faster. If you ever have listened to any American football quarterbacks, a lot of them will talk about sort of the moment that the game slowed down. Like they talk about like all of a sudden they're in a game and everything is in slow motion for them instead of like this rapid fire coming at them. And it's because they've become more efficient at processing this information because they've been practicing it and they get better at it. And so they're more able to see where all their receivers are. Do they need to check down? Do they need to, you know, take the ball themselves and run? You know, they can kind of make those decisions more efficiently and effectively because they can see what's happening and they can process it faster. They're more attentive to the movement patterns of their opponent. So if you remember back, we talked about how it's better to have an external focus in that you know, especially as you're using that sort of analyzing and planning and assessing, that you're taking in not just what you need to accomplish at the moment, but you can also say, here's what I need to do, and here's what they are doing, or here's what I'm anticipating them to do in response to that. And I can see what they're doing. This is especially really good for goalies, that as they, you know, when you look at soccer goalkeepers who are, they have almost like that preternatural sense of like anticipating how the play is developing and where they want to position themselves within the goal. It's because they're looking at these movement patterns, and they're looking at how these, they're better able to predict the flight pattern of a ball than a novice is. And that's just repetition and practice and deliberately searching for it. So it's not just, you know, again, these things don't just like magically happen. The more they do it and the more you put effort towards trying to figure out these things and trying to figure out where these players are going, the better at it you get. And they search more systematically for cues, that they're just better at. They do it in a very systematic way instead of like, what's over here, what's over here, what's over here, what's over here. They kind of scan the field, you know, consistently from time to time to time. This is a video. I'm not going to show it today because it's about 5 minutes. It'll take a little bit of a long time. But I did send the link to Carrie, and she'll share that with you. It's really interesting. So these little dots that you can see are essentially where a player is looking. They're wearing special glasses that track their eye movement. And you can see they run through a number of different scenarios with these soccer players, of whether it's the goalie, whether it's footwork, whether it's a set piece, that you can see sort of like where these, what they're actually directly looking at. It's actually a really cool video. So thinking about distractors, you know, what's going to draw what's going to pull focus, right, to use a film term, what's going to draw our attention away from, you know, what we actually want to do. So they may be defined as, you know, visual distractors, whether they're spectators. The classic example is the basketball free throw, right? When there's all the fans that are behind the basket and they're making all of these like motions to try to distract them. Of this, for a lot of reasons why flash photography is not allowed, or auditory distractors. You know, when you think about like Seattle Stadium, if you've ever been to the Seahawks or the Seattle Sounders, right? That they're so loud. Their stadiums are so loud, right? That if you watch Seahawks games, you know, you can see how the stadium is designed so that the sound is actually directed down towards the field, and the field is the same decibel level as the surface of an aircraft carrier jet while F-16s are taking off. It's that loud. And so one, that's obviously incredibly distracting, but two, now you have to change your style of play and you have to use, you know, silent snap counts or things that you may not be as comfortable with. And so there's a reason why there are more offsides and false start penalties at that stadium by visiting teams than anywhere else, right? Because of the volume. Other internal distractors. This is where I live next to a train track. So if you hear a train, I apologize. So we have negative self-talk, right? That with our internal monologue, things that are not helpful to us. Like if I'm being distracted by an auditory, you know, train horn while I'm giving a presentation, you know, we all know or have ourselves, right, use self-talk that is not super helpful, right? We get down on ourselves, we tell ourselves that we're idiots, that we're stupid for making that mistake, that we get in our own head. You know, that's an internal distractor. Attending to past events, right? Like I talked about before. You know, oh, I can't believe I made that mistake and now I have to make up for it. Or even other things that like may have happened outside of, you know, off the pitch, where you're thinking about a fight you had with your best friend, or you're thinking about, you know, the homework you have to do that night, or, you know, athletes think that they're really good at compartmentalizing. They think that they're really good at leaving their home life or their work life or whatever, you know, in the locker room, that they don't take it out onto the pitch with them. And that's just not true. I have found in a lot of my practice that athletes are not great at that. You know, thinking about future events, like, you know, what will happen if, you know, kind of trying to think instead of, you know, maybe 2 steps ahead, which might be more appropriate. And you're thinking like, especially when people catastrophize, is a fancy word for like this sort of like the end game is like the worst possible outcome you could possibly have. When you're tired, right? If you're not sleeping well, if you're tired, just everything is worse. It is harder to concentrate because again, you're trying to use that cognitive energy that your energy is just depleted. You just don't have enough energy to do both the physical demands and the mental demands. Inadequate motivation, if you don't want to be there, obviously you're not going to focus on it. That if for whatever reason, that we have lots of different kinds of motivations for players, you know, especially in, I think, in club soccer, where you may have a lot of kids who have very different reasons for being there. Where you have kids who want to do this for fun, you have kids who want to do this for fitness, you have kids who want to do this because they want to hang out with their friends, you have kids who want to do this because they love soccer, they want to play it every single second of the day, you know, that can create some turmoil as well. And then lastly, I just want to mention overanalysis of body mechanics. Sometimes we call this choking. And this we see in more expert players, where they get overly focused on the physical task. So again, we're choosing an internal focus that is not helpful. So way back in the beginning, yeah, that's my dog, Kingsley, making that noise. Way back in the beginning, when I mentioned that you want to have an external focus, that once you've learned a skill, right, you're much more effective if you focus on the ball trajectory rather than how you want to execute the skill itself. So once you've learned it, then you want to get to that you shift from that internal focus of controlled processing of information, where you're thinking about foot placement and you're thinking about where your hips are facing and you're thinking about, you know, what your follow through looks like and all of those things. Once you're past that, now it's more important to focus on ball trajectory, right? Where do you want the ball to go? What do you want to make happen? It's more important to have that outcome. And once you've reached that stage where where the outcome is the most important thing, if you revert back to the internal focus, where you're overly thinking about all of those physical components, right? This is called the conscious processing hypothesis, that you're focusing too much conscious attention to the task at hand, as if they were a novice and not the more expert player or the more advanced player than they really are. And that's where we get into this like choking or yips that we might see in golf or baseball, that we have an inappropriate internal focus. So how can we alleviate this overanalysis? Because I'm sure we've had athletes or players who, you know, will sit there and will be like, I don't understand. Like they've been able to do this skill forever. All of a sudden, what's happening, right? Where did it go? What's going on, right? And a lot of times athletes like, I don't know. And their immediate response is to refocus internally on the skill that they're trying to achieve, right? Their initial instinct is to go back to this over processing and over analyzing, when in fact that's the absolute wrong thing that they do. But that's almost entirely an athlete's first response, right? So we want to make sure that we are have that external focus, and ways that we can do that are, one, I put imagery on here, and we can have a whole other workshop on imagery. Imagery is very difficult. A lot of people think it's very easy, and it actually turns out to be really difficult once we talk about all the different parts and pieces of what imagery is. But having sort of like a mental run through of what you want to see happen can be helpful. Pre-shot routines, or whether that's a free kick or a corner kick, a throw in, whatever. If you do it exactly the same every single time, that will keep you focused on the task and allow for some of those external distractors to fall away. The secondary task focus, what I mean by secondary task is the outcome, right? That we want to focus on what we're trying to achieve rather than what specific movements we're trying to do. So there's the primary task focus is the skill. The secondary task focus would be the outcome. And we want to move away from the primary task focus to the secondary task focus, so that we are we're making better decisions in terms of where we want that ball to go. We want to have exposure to stressful situations. And this is where especially our role as a coach in terms of how we plan our practices. And this kind of goes also to, number one, it gets us more comfortable when we build in competitive drills, right, into our practice. Then that gets us more used to being competitive, so that by the time we get to a game situation, we've been here before, right? The other part of that is we want to make sure that we're putting our athletes in stressful situations in a safe way, obviously, in a way that's supported, so that they can practice that cognitive energy that it takes to be competitive and to focus on what we need them to focus on. So every time we have a drill, right, we want to make sure that we also are sharing what specific things we want our athletes to be looking at, focusing on, thinking about, right? Because I can't ask an athlete to run a mile if I've only given them drills to do 100-yard sprints, right? So I want to make sure that I'm creating these stressful situations, these competitive situations, these situations where it's going to take this cognitive energy over a longer period of time, so that when they do have to play for 45 minutes, right, that it's not this extra cognitive task isn't taking away that energy from them. And then mindfulness is another one. We could do a whole workshop on mindfulness. But the idea of, particularly with that negative self-talk, which I use self-talk a lot with my athletes. I find it incredibly helpful, that, planning what we're going to say to ourselves can be really useful, and being able to differentiate between the thoughts that are productive versus the thoughts that are destructive, right? The thoughts that are not helpful for us. And mindfulness can help us differentiate between two, and also to not pay attention to those negative thoughts. And it kind of also goes back to the misnomer of like, I don't want to think about anything, which again is not a thing that happens. It's just not, it's not real. But we can decide what we're going to think about and what we're going to pay attention to, and mindfulness plays a big part in that. So improving concentration, is this focused state of mind, this deliberate mental effort, right? And so the word deliberate is really important here, so that when we're designing our practices, that we are being very clear in the expectations of what we think our athletes, what's going to be the most appropriate, when you think about broad internal, broad external, narrow internal, narrow, to share that information with the athlete as we're doing the drills, right? That this is what you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about where you want the ball you should be thinking about ball placement. You should be focusing on this thing instead of that thing. If you're doing a dribbling drill, do you want them to focus on their footwork? But now you also have a defender. So when you have an athlete, when you've got two different things that you're trying to pay attention to, allowing for their ability to shift their focus between what the ball is doing, what their feet are doing, and what trying to anticipate what the defender is doing. And so I think sometimes we either overemphasize one before the athlete is ready, that maybe they're still trying to really think about their footwork because they're more novice players and they're not able to anticipate yet what their defender is doing, but we can maybe give them specific cues of like, so when you look at your defender, where is their weight shifting? Where are their hips pointed? What are they looking at? Are they looking at you? Are they looking at the ball? Are they looking at somebody else, right? What are you trying to achieve during this dribble drill? Are you just focusing on the footwork? Are you trying to move the ball? Are you trying to get into a position? Are you trying to have, so you can have a good cross pass? Are you trying to draw that defender away? All of those things, as we build them, and what's called scaffolding, right? We start with one thing, then we add another thing, and then we add another thing, we add another thing, so that we can help them in their ability to shift their focus back and forth appropriately. There's a myth, this myth of multitasking. We're like, oh yeah, I can totally do two things at once, and you cannot. You might be really good at switching back and forth very quickly, but multitasking is actually not a real thing. That your brain, just physiologically, your brain does not process more than one thing at a time. It's very binary. It does this or it does this. More expert players are able to make that shift back and forth very, very quickly. So it might appear that they are quote unquote multitasking, but you can really only, especially when you have novice players, you can only expect them to be focusing on one task at a time. And then as they get better, we can then expect them to be able to shift back and forth. And then we can expect them to narrow that time it takes to shift. So we can use these simulations in practice, whether it's a competitive situation, whether it's distractors are present, particularly for, when you've got these sort of discrete moments of set pieces. Help your athletes develop cue words so that they can repeat those words before they complete the skill. So for example, if I'm teaching a throw-in, right? And we want to make sure that the athlete is not just throwing from their arms, but they're throwing from their legs, right? So we might come up with a couple different choices of cue phrases, for that athlete. And it can be anything that they want it to be. And it's better if it comes from them than you. You might be able to give them some options. So I might say, okay, so if we want to have a good throw in, maybe a cue word might be powerful, or might be drive, or might be push, right? Or it might be momentum. Any of those words would work. It just depends on like what the athlete wants, what is most meaningful to the athlete. Because it is best when it's their word that they come up with. Other situations where you might have a motivational word instead of an instructional word. There's a really famous clip from the 2016 Olympics of Lori Hernandez on the balance beam in gymnastics, and she kind of stands up to the beam and the camera's like really close, and you can see her say to herself, "You got this," right? That she has this one little motivational phrase that she uses right before a competition. That sort of helps her like, yeah, you know what? I'm good to go. Non-judgmental thinking, this kind of goes back to mindfulness and self-talk, right? Of instead of being like super hard on ourselves, instead of being defeatist, instead of, forcing ourselves into like a shame spiral, that, we can change those thought processes. Establishing routines and establishing our cues. So using those cues within a pre-shot routine. This is sort of also what we talk about, like, control the controllables all the time, right? We hear this from every single coach all the time. And what does that really look like? Well, what it looks like is I am able to control exactly what I do before every single game, every single, free kick. I can control what I do right before the ball is dropped. I can control all of these things that will help me achieve the outcome that I want it to achieve. I can't control the outcome as much as I think I want to, or I think I can. I can only do all of the things that will make it more and more and more likely that the outcome will be what I want it to be. Develop competition plans. So you want to make sure that, you've strategized, that everybody understands, the plays that you're focusing on, the goals of the game, the goals of practice. A lot of times we do goal setting. We set goals for practices, but we don't always set goals for games. And I think this is a really good place to do that. And again, we can have a whole thing about goal setting. I love to use it. But how can we be consistently preparing for competition every single time? And then overlearning skills, right? And this also kind of goes back to that overanalysis. If something is overlearned, we don't need to necessarily, and that means we know it so well, we've got it so automatic that we don't have to concentrate on the actual moves and motions that we're trying to achieve. So if you look at some of these, so like I mentioned gymnastics a minute ago, at the end of one Olympic cycle, that's when athletes start working on new routines, so that by the time they get to the Olympics, they've been doing these routines for at least 3 years. And so when you hear of athletes who made a routine change, or they made a coaching change, and they made something, within 2 years of the Olympics, that's actually like a really big deal. It's hugely disruptive, right? And oftentimes can be for the better, but it can also be not great. So we want to make sure that we know a skill so well, right, that we can think about. It's not that we don't want to learn a skill so well that we don't have to think about it. We want to learn a skill so well so that we can think about other things, right? That we can think about the things that we need to think about in terms of things like strategizing and anticipating our defenders and those kinds of things. That's what we mean when we talk about we don't have to think about it. It's because we can think about everything else. So when we talk about a pre-performance routine, we want to make sure that we look at the behavior that we're trying to do. So let's say it is, a free kick, right? That they're trying to, what are they trying to achieve? Where do they want the ball to be? And to focus more on what you and the ball are doing, and not so much on, say, what the goalie are doing, what the defenders are doing. And why are you doing what you're doing? And then you can start to associate some of those cue phrases with it, right? And I will sit with my athlete and I'll say, okay, what's the first step? What do you have to do first? Great. What do we have to do second? Perfect. What do we have to do third? And we write down in detail all of the steps that we need to do to make sure that that skill happens the way we want it to have happen. And then we look for places, I'll look for places where we might add in a cue word or a cue phrase. So for example, I was working with a baseball player who had a shoulder injury, and we were really working on his batting routine and making sure that he was driving with his legs and using his core strength instead of just trying to muscle through with his arms, which was not helping and leading to a shoulder injury. And so one of the things that we came up with, that as we sort of walked through all the minute details of, walking to, from the dugout to home plate, and when did he put on his gloves and when did he hold his bat? And we came up with a thing that as he would Velcro his gloves, right, that was the tightening action that would help remind him to tighten his core. So we were sort of able to connect a motion that he was already doing, but associate a cue phrase with it that now had a broader meaning, right, for the whole task, right? And then you have to practice that pre-performance routine, that, you have to be using these things in practice during drills. And maybe the drill is we all come up with a pre-performance routine, and then we have to use it during this skill, right? And then we can decide, did that pre-performance routine work? Do we need to tweak it? Do we need to pick a different word? Do we find ourselves using something else that works better? And adjust it so that by the time you get to a game, again, it's an overlearned skill that you're used to doing, so that everything else, the fact that you're in a competition doesn't make that much of a difference, right? I always approach things in terms of, a lot of people I think use the phrase like, I want to compete the way I play, or, I want to compete the way I practice. So it's, a little bit more relaxed, or it's not as stressful, because we know what stress can do. But I kind of take the opposite opinion of like, you want to practice being competitive. You want to practice how you want to play, right? Because again, it takes that cognitive energy to do that, so that you won't be fatigued when it's necessary. So I think we have some time. I know I kind of covered a lot of stuff for you guys.
It was great information. I have one question for you, Leah.
Yes.
So how can a coach create an environment to help players achieve a flow state?
Okay. So part of it is we want to talk about sort of the climate of practice. One, so this kind of goes to sort of that motivational component, that we are emphasizing the tasks that we're trying to achieve, and not the outcome necessarily, that we're not focused on wins and losses, that we're focused on skills. So then within practice, what does that mean? So when we're breaking down our drills, and someone, appears that they're not maybe focusing on the correct things, to have, to, instead of just, which our automatic thing is to give them direction, especially if you're working with slightly older kids, like middle school, high school kids, like you can actually ask them, what were you thinking about when you did that drill? What were you looking at when you did that drill? And then ask them follow-up questions. How helpful was that to you? Right? So that it's much less of me telling you what to do as you telling me what you want to do, right? That becomes a lot more meaningful to the athlete. And so then I can say, okay, so if it wasn't super helpful to be focusing on, to be looking at this, what do you think would be helpful? What do you want to look at? And then, you can have this back and forth between you as an expert, right? Quote unquote expert, of like, so here's what I found helpful, right? And this is kind of where you can get into if they're overly focused internally when they should be externally focused, or, you can say, here's what I think would be helpful. Let's try this. Let's see if this works. And then we can go from there, right? That sometimes, and you'll have your own style of how you want to have that conversation, right, as a coach. But I have found that it can be much more useful to, instead of just directing the athlete, which is often my initial instinct, right? Just tell them what to do and they'll do it, is to instead say, what were you doing and how was that helpful, right? And then you start to develop players who can make better decisions, right? And especially in soccer, when you want to foster some of that creativity, right, and that variability on the field, that can actually have these like sort of ripple effects in terms of better decision making and putting that decision making in context, right? That, okay, so we did it here and that definitely worked. We tried it again over here and that did not work. So how do we need to change it now that we're in a new situation?
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Thank you. I have a few more for you.
Great.
So,
love it.
is it possible for a player to focus for an entire training or game? What should coaches expect as far as how possible it is for a player to focus the entire time?
So I kind of think of it as just similar to endurance. Do you expect your athletes to run full speed the whole game? No, that's not how the game works. So it's not so much of, are they going to focus throughout all 90 minutes, but what are they going to focus on and how intensely do they need to focus in that moment? So, you know, in soccer especially, you have sort of like these bursts of expended energy, and then you kind of like have to shift around and maybe you go over here, but you're not like running full speed the whole time, right? And so it's sort of similar in terms of focus, that when you're in that, you know, moment, like, yeah, you might need to really zero in, and then you might shift your focus. So if the ball is somewhere else down the field, you know, if you've got your attackers way downfield and you're a defender, you're not going to check out, right? You're not going to be like, oh, what's going on, right? But you may not be focused as intensely as you were before. And you can kind of start to plan of like, oh, right, this happened last time. What am I going to make, you know, start to think about, you know, and be anticipating, right, when the ball comes back on your half of the pitch. But no, you're not going to be like totally zoned in the whole time. But as they get better at focusing, they're better at shifting where their focus is and the intensity of what that focus is.
I like that analogy to the endurance. That makes a lot of sense to me. I have one more question. So what ways can coaches help to motivate players to learn a skill at home?
So I think it depends on sort of what you're trying to achieve with the skill, and sort of what motivates them generally. So when I think about motivation, and this is sort of maybe the 30,000 foot view, to me, motivation is all about what you value, right? Because if you don't think something is important, who cares, right? So for example, I'll give you an exercise, maybe might not appear relevant at first, but I was working with a woman who was an exerciser, not a competitive athlete, and she was having a lot of difficulty getting motivated to exercise. And it was, you know, as we were having these conversations, you know, and she would talk about her grandkids. And I said, do you ever find yourself getting really tired when you're playing with she had like toddlers, or, you know, her grandkids were like 4 years old, or, you know, and those, you know, they're running around, they're out in the yard, they're doing all these things. And I was like, wouldn't it be cool to be able to like keep up with them? Right. And so the relationship to her grandchildren became that motivation. So instead of feeling like, oh, I have to motivate because my doctor told me to, right, that's not something that's going to motivate her. But if she frames it as, oh, if I'm more fit, I can keep up with this thing that's really important to me, right? So to be motivated to do sort of these at-home exercises and workouts, you know, is to think about, well, what is your motivation? Is it because you want to contribute to a team? Do you want to be, is that what's important to you as a player? Is that you are a part of a group? Is it because you want to be able to share that knowledge with other people and you want to lead by example? Is it because you have seen other players do it and you want to be able to do it too, and you want to match them up? So it's kind of like you kind of have to think about, and this does take a little bit extra work to think about what is going to be most helpful for this specific athlete. And how is that going to contribute to the long game? Because especially with kids, it's really hard to kind of like get them to buy into what's happening now as how that's going to pay off in the future. I also think about a lot of times, I was watching an interview with Michael Keaton, the actor, and when he was starting out in LA and he wasn't like getting a lot of jobs, so he was doing a lot of auditioning. And he was having a really hard time because he wasn't getting anything. But then he thought, you know what? Every audition is a chance to act. And so every time you have to practice a skill at home, that's a chance to play soccer, and you love playing soccer. So great, right? And so if we kind of reframe of, I have to do these drills because my coach told me to, which is not motivating at all, right? That how can we say, oh man, I get to play soccer, right? I worked with a baseball player a long time, and he was having just, everything was really fatiguing, and it was like work. And I found a quote and I said, you know what? They don't ever say work ball, they say play ball. Like you get to literally play catch. Like how awesome is that? And once he started to think of like, oh, I'm not just doing this because I have a scholarship and I'm required to, I forgot that I love baseball, right? And so for him, his motivation then became joy, right? So for each athlete, there's a whole long continuum of motivation, and we can go into all of that. But to me, it's what is important to that kid, what is important to that, and how can we link that back to soccer.
We had talked a few weeks ago about journaling, and that might be an option for coaches too, if they're working with their players on journaling, that maybe that's one of the topics one day, that they get the kids to think about what is motivating them to play, and that may help drive some of these points home, or even for them to figure out what to focus on.
Yeah, and it could be, simple prompts as, what's your favorite thing about soccer?
Yeah.
Right. And you might get, I play soccer because I like to hang out with my friends. Great. Do you want to keep up with your friends?
Right.
I like to play soccer because I like to contribute to a team. Awesome. That gives you a lot of information.
Perfect. Well, I thank you, Leah, so much for all of your expert knowledge and information you share with us today. I will share that video out with everybody, and we'll post the recording of this as well as our PowerPoints. They have that information. And if you, anybody on the call needs anything from us, or you'd like to get in touch with Leah, just feel free to reach out to me and I will help you do so.
I'm happy to answer any questions. I know I threw a lot of like really technical information at you and a lot of definitions. So if you go back and you're like, wait, what was it? And you want me to re-explain something, I'm more than happy to do that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Leah. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.